Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Shamta Hunter and I'm on behalf of UBC Sustainability Initiative welcome you to UBC Reads Sustainability, which is taking place on an ancestral, unceded and traditional land of the Musqueam peoples. A bit about UBC Reads Sustainability. It is a speaker series which aims to bring authors on relevant global issues to engage in dialogues across disciplines and build connections. So we typically do about 2 to 3 authors in an academic year between September to April, and we would love to hear from you about any suggestions on authors that you would like to bring to campus. So if you can take a moment to fill out the online survey after the event, that would be great. And I'm a little bit out of breath because I've been running around. Sorry. A couple of housekeeping items. The washrooms are just out the door down the stairs. I will ask you to please hold on to your questions until after the talk. There are 2 mics set up on either side of the main floor for you to ask questions. If you can come to the main mics, please let me know and I'll bring a mic to you. Please also note that this talk is being live streamed and video recorded, so if you are asking a question on the mic, you will be on camera. The recordings are archived on UBC Sustainability YouTube channel so that you can access them later on and share them with your friends. The format, we will have about 30 or so minutes of the main talk by our guest speaker and then a one-on-one interview style Q&A on stage here, and then we'll open it up to you guys for questions. This time I will ask you to please turn off your electronic devices, any cell phones. Elizabeth also has agreed to stay after the talk to sign some books, and the UBC bookstore is outside selling her books as well. Okay, now I would like to invite Dr. Catherine Harrison to introduce our speaker. Catherine Harrison is a Senior Associate Dean of Arts, Faculty and Equity, and a Professor of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. She has degrees in chemical engineering and political science from Western University, MIT, and UBC. Before entering academia, she worked as a chemical engineer in the oil industry and as a policy analyst for both Environment Canada and the United States Congress. Dr. Harrison is the author or editor of several volumes, including Global Commons, Domestic Decisions, The Comparative Politics of Climate Change, and has published widely on Canadian and U.S. climate and environmental policy. She is a frequent media commentator and critic of Canadian climate policy. Dr. Harrison.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and to be hosting this talk and book discussion with Elizabeth May, who is one of my Canadian heroes. I would like to acknowledge our sponsors for today's event, the UBC Sustainability Initiative, USI, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, also known as PICS, and the Irving K. Barber Learning Center. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth May. The book that Elizabeth will be discussing is a wonderful combination of personal memoir integrated with really gutsy policy discussion of issues from reform of the Canadian economy, climate change policy, and democratic reform. And so I'm hoping that she'll weave some of that personal reflection through the talk as well, and I'll keep the introduction fairly short as a result. Elizabeth May is the leader of the Green Party of Canada and its first elected member of Parliament, representing Saanich-Gulf Islands. In 2005, Elizabeth was made an Officer of the Order of Canada in recognition of her decades of leadership in the Canadian environmental movement. She graduated from Dalhousie Law School and was admitted to the bar in both Nova Scotia and Ontario. She practiced law in Ottawa with the Public Interest Advocacy Centre prior to becoming the Senior Policy Advisor to the Federal Minister of the Environment, Tom McMillan, from 1986 to 1988. For 17 years thereafter, Elizabeth served as the Executive Director of the Sierra Club of Canada. As a proud mother and grandmother, She lives in Sidney, British Columbia. Elizabeth is the author of 8 books, including the most recent one that she'll be speaking about today, Who We Are, Reflections on My Life and on Canada. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth May. Thank you.
See you down there. Okay. So I think I am mic'd and everybody can hear me all right? Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Shumta. Thank you to UBC Reads Sustainability for inviting me. This is such a lovely room. I always love it when there's something called an old auditorium. And it has lovely lines and lovely volume, and I'm glad to be here with you to talk about my book, but to slide into more recent analysis of the politics around climate. When I wrote Who We Are, it was always a struggle to actually, this is my 8th book, as you just heard, it's always a struggle as someone who wants to write a book for a Canadian audience to find a Canadian publisher. It used to be easier. We've lost a number of Canadian publishers, really large houses like McClellan and Stewart, who published the book I wrote about the struggle to stop the clear-cutting in Guayahanas, to what now is Guayahanas Reserve National Park. That book I called Paradise One, and when I wrote it back in 1990 and it was published by McClellan and Stewart, I hoped I'd kind of be able to stay with McClellan and Stewart, and then they said, people don't like environmental books all that much. And then I found Anna Porter at Key Porter Books. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, if you've ever looked at the Canadian publishing industry, Key Porter Books no longer exists. McClellan and Stewart exists, but it was purchased by Random House. And so it's really looking for only certain kinds of titles from Canadian authors. So I'm very grateful that I found Greystone Books, which is here in Vancouver, because they agreed to publish Who We Are. But they didn't like my plan for a book at all, because I wanted to write a book about policy, and this was back, and the book was, well, initially talking to them about the book, and when I was writing it was in 2013, and I really, in the throes of being the only Green elected member of Parliament and dealing with a majority government under Stephen Harper, I had a lot I wanted to say, and they said, people aren't going to want to read that. So they said, you have to write, we're interested in publishing your autobiography. And I said, well, I'm not interested in writing my autobiography. So what Catherine has referenced already is this weaving in of personal stories and anecdote to enliven a discussion on ecological economics or to help explain the science of climate change was part of that conflict that often happens between publisher and author of and the publisher has to be right. I mean, they're in the business and writers aren't, except that we want to write. So the book is really quite personal and focuses in the very beginning, of course, on how I was formed as an activist, which I truly was, as surely as a child growing up in a family that have always been shoemakers is likely to become a shoemaker, and a child that grows up in a family that has always had lawyers in the family is a lot more likely to be a lawyer. And so, well, my mom was a really amazing activist. She came by it naturally. She hadn't any particular indications at the point that she married my dad that she was going to be a trailblazing activist. She was a sculptor, and my dad had decided to become an insurance accountant, so he had he used to describe his profession, actually. My dad could be quite droll, and he'd say, oh, I really chose a quite romantic profession. I'm an accountant. He'd deliver this with a straight face. But my mom, as a sculptor and a pianist, was all about the arts, and she was a young mom, and she went to see the pediatrician for my regular round of inoculations when she asked the doctor, what can I do to protect the baby against nuclear weapons testing? I've been reading about it. Is there something we can give her to keep the strontium-90 from going into her bones and teeth? What do we do about that? And the doctor, the pediatrician, didn't have any good answers for her. And so she became part of a movement of, and this was in the mid-50s, so in the height of the Cold War. I was growing up in the US. My dad was British, my mom was from the States. She didn't like living in England. They tried it for a while. And he didn't like living in the States, but he had less to say about it. My dad used to say, our marriage has worked, you see, because your mother makes the small decisions, and I get to make all the big decisions, like what to have for breakfast, and your mother decides what country we live in. So initially, my mom decided we were living in the States, and it wasn't until we went to Cape Breton on holiday in 1972 that my dad finally found a way out, which was that we fell in love with Cape Breton Island, and we moved to a very small village on the Cabot Trail. But back to my mom becoming an activist, she had this instinct, which is unusual, which was that she didn't experience a sense of chronic failure and disempowerment as a citizen. She had a strong belief that citizens could change things. She'd always had it. I think it's inspired actually by a story I didn't tell in the book, which was my mom grew up in an era, which was obvious from the book though, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt being the hero to people who'd come through the Depression, people who'd seen what Herbert Hoover had done, people who suddenly saw FDR as a hero in rescuing the U.S. economy and then leading the U.S. through a war against fascism. But when FDR was first running for president, my mom was about 3 or 4 maybe, and she had this notion that the presidential race was on a piece of elevated railway track, like the loop that she saw in downtown Manhattan, the L line. She thought, okay, they're going to run a presidential race. And then somehow she heard that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had physical challenges, that he was disabled, then she thought, and she'd ask her parents, this Franklin Roosevelt, is he running this race? Yes. And is it true he can't walk? Yes. Well, then she decided she better pray for this man because only a miracle could let a man in that condition win a race. It wasn't going to happen otherwise. So that's the early formation of, I think, why it was my mom was convinced that citizens could make a difference. That Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who clearly had no chance against it, and she said, she also asked her parents, the man he's running against, can he walk? Oh, yes. My grandparents didn't see the significance of her question. They didn't know that she was visualizing an actual physical race. The presidential race was going to be run. And there was no chance that Franklin Delano Roosevelt could win a race. And when he became president, she didn't just think he was a wonderful president. I think it was close to worship. And so she grew up in a very different era. I sometimes say this to young people when I'm talking to them in schools, and I realize they've never really seen political leadership that could inspire awe, much less a sense of reverence or worship. It's the most as if you can get a spirit of toleration in politics. You're doing okay. But for my mom's background, for whatever reason, led her to decide that if atmospheric nuclear weapons testing, and she read as much science as she could, as a pianist and a sculptor with no science background, but she also believed that you can read and understand as an adult. You can figure things out. And she read the science on strontium-90, and every time an atmospheric nuclear weapons test took place, at the level of the stratosphere, these radionuclides, which were long-lived and bioaccumulated through the food chain, so she was aware that strontium-90 was distributed in clouds that fell as dust, that fell to the grass, that when the cows ate the grass would accumulate in the milk from the cows. And she'd go to professors at the local university and say, is there any way, what would you do to avoid having our children getting too much strontium-90? How can we reduce what they get into their bodies? And she found university scientists who'd say, well, I wouldn't say this publicly, but since you're asking me, we don't put fresh milk. We don't buy fresh milk. We buy the powdered milk because my theory is the strontium-90 will have dissipated before we mix the powdered milk with water and give it to our kids. And another scientist told her, I've been crushing up calcium tablets and putting it in ice cream for my kids, because I'm hoping that if we load their bones and teeth with calcium, there won't be room, because the body reads strontium-90 as calcium and directs it to bones as teeth. And scientist said, I don't really know if this is going to work, but I've been doing it at home for my kids. So as a result, my brother and I never had edible ice cream or drinkable milk till the nuclear weapons testing stopped. It was, but we didn't know any better. We had watery powdered milk and very chalky ice cream. And what we did learn as small children, I was the only child in kindergarten who'd warned the other children not to eat the snow because of the strontium-90. Other parents just told them, don't eat the yellow snow. Nobody else in kindergarten was fussing about radionuclides. Just to say, there's nothing more inspiring or empowering to a small child than to see a mother, broaden this to say a parent, who's taking action in society and deciding that if you don't like what's going on around you, you're actually doing something about it. So I was totally raised to be an activist. And by the time President John F. Kennedy signed the test ban treaty with Russia and the UK, those were the only countries at the time that were testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, the USSR at the time, I was absolutely convinced that my mommy had done this. And it was true, because who knows if without her efforts, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of mostly moms in this movement. And we walked together when I was in grade 1. We walked in the Aldermaston March in London from the nuclear testing facilities in Aldermaston in the UK down to London to a huge rally of 100,000 people in Trafalgar Square. And my mom spoke there. So I was quite certain that this is what my mom had done. This is important in forming an activist. So if you have small children and you're an activist and you're going, it was wonderful on Saturday in Burnaby to be walking with, I think it was 10,000 people. It was certainly, the RCMP estimate was 5,500. It was certainly more than that, but that's okay. It was thousands and thousands of people. And what was really, it's always wonderful to be in a large gathering of people gathered for common purpose, sharing the same goals, and intergenerational. So the numbers of people there pushing small children in baby carriages. Actually, David Suzuki had his grandson Rio in a little stroller that they were pushing along. There were all kinds of children there, and my grown daughter was with me. But to see protest as a family affair is very important. So I experienced that early. So it's no real surprise that as I grew up, I was involved in grassroots political movements, but I wasn't involved in capital P politics. I didn't have, I didn't see myself as running for office, and I didn't for a very long time. I did get involved, and since this is a discussion around sustainability, I was very fortunate that through the work I was doing in the environmental movement, and that also was by happenstance. I was living in Cape Breton Island, as I mentioned, in the village of Margaree Harbour, which is absolutely spectacularly beautiful. And I'm only saying that because I have two friends who are also from Margaree who are here, so it's just so exciting. But anyway, it's spectacular. And suddenly the pulp and paper company from the Causeway decided that the spruce budworm was such a threat to the forests, and they got the government of Nova Scotia to agree to spray from fixed-wing aircraft from the air toxic chemicals that are now banned. So no real surprise that I got involved in the effort to stop the spraying program. Hugely fortunate that the government of Nova Scotia listened to us so that it didn't happen. And year on year I was doing environmental work as an activist and not thinking anything else of it. This is what you do. If you care about an issue, you get involved and you work on it. And by times, and this was great good fortune, I discovered that I could go to Dalhousie Law School without an undergrad degree. I'd been too busy helping my parents with running a restaurant, when we moved to Margaree, my parents opened a restaurant and gift shop. Long story, I won't digress, but it's pretty funny actually, because if you open a restaurant and gift shop in a community of 42 people who don't eat out, why do you think you're going to do well? I don't know. But anyway, I finally found my way to law school, and I got involved in the early parts of Canada's engagement in sustainability, which was a great good fortune. as you heard from Catherine's introduction, that I was brought into the office of the Federal Minister of Environment in 1986 because he wanted to have someone in his office who was actually an environmentalist. And that's not intended to be funny. The ministerial staff of a cabinet minister are people who are part of their political party support system, not people who have any background in the subject area. So it was quite unusual that Tom McMillan, being a progressive conservative, would decide that his political staff should include someone who wasn't a member of his party, but who was known as an environmental activist and had some policy background in the issues they were dealing with. And through that, I was involved early in something called the World Commission on Environment and Development, which got known for its short form title, the Brundtland Commission, because Gru Harlem Brundtland, who was at the point of the beginnings of this commission, she was the opposition leader in the Parliament and government of Norway. And right after she took on the title of being chair of the World Commission on Environment and Development, the government fell and she became prime minister. And there was a widespread assumption that now that she was prime minister, she wouldn't have time for working on a grassroots consultation that was global with a group of commissioners drawn from all around the world, many of them former heads of government, but also policy wonks and scientists and so on. There wasn't an assumption that she would stay on as prime minister, but she did. And that elevated the cachet of the World Commission on Environment and Development quite a lot. And it became known as the Brundtland Commission. And the report, Our Common Future, came out in 1987 when I was working in the Government of Canada and when we were grappling with what kinds of things can we do to change the way we make decisions. The Secretary General of the Brundtland Commission became one of my very best friends. His name was Jim McNeill, and he grew up in Depression, Saskatchewan, and his hero was Tommy Douglas. And when he finished school, he went right to work for Tommy Douglas as a deputy minister in the Saskatchewan government. So he had really an enormous background of knowledge about Canada's challenges economically, socially, and environmentally. And Jim McNeill, as Secretary General of the Brundtland Commission, made the observation that if we change the way we make decisions, we'll change the kinds of decisions we make. And that led right into the work that I was doing when I was in the Ministry of Environment's office to create the National Round Table on Environment and Economy, to work towards more consensus-based decision-making, to have ministers of government sitting at the table with representatives of trade unions, representatives from big business, as well as environmental grassroots organizers, as well as scientists, and actually try to figure out where's the common ground, what does sustainability look like. We were actually much farther ahead in 1987 than where we are now, because sustainability these days is a term that gets lip service without people really understanding it at all. I went to a meeting a few years ago, right after I was elected as the Member of Parliament for Saanich-Gulf Islands. I don't suppose it was a mistake, but I found myself in a meeting of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. They were holding an Ottawa meeting and inviting members of Parliament. Actually, they had me on a panel, that's why I went. Never mind. And one of the CEOs was explaining sustainability for the oil sands sector, which I quickly understood him to mean, how do we keep making money there? How do we hold on to sustainability of our business? With no consideration of the climate crisis in the presentation he made. This is a problem for sustainability. So my background in terms of talking on issues of sustainable development goes back for me to those early days of trying to figure out what it would look like for Canada if we changed the kinds of decisions we make by changing the way we make those decisions. And it's been, it was an extraordinary experience in the late 1980s to see large problems as merely challenges for good decision-making and political will. So to give you a sense of that, and I talk about some of this in the book as well, when I went into the Ministry of Environment's office, one of the top issues that they were dealing with then, and which I had been working on as an activist, I'd been part of the Canadian Coalition on Acid Rain. I'd gone down with delegations to the US Congress and Senate to explain that pollution from the Ohio Valley was killing lakes and streams in Nova Scotia and hurting forests in Quebec and so on. And when I got into government, working with the Ministry of Environment, it was very clear that Brian Mulroney, I don't know how many of you know this, but this was a majority government under Brian Mulroney. Mulroney had decided that every time he had any meetings at all with the US president, who was then Ronald Reagan, the top issue between Canada and the US was resolving acid rain. The top issue. And Mulroney never gave up, which is also interesting considering that when he first approached Ronald Reagan had been quoted as saying that acid rain was caused by ducks. And it's not even, so it was a bit, but what we did then for historical interest, and this is again during the time before the Brundtland Commission report had reported in, but what Mulroney decided our approach would be was what we called the clean hands policy. To give you a sense on acid rain was caused basically by a quick fix that was done to reduce air pollution problems in the 1960s. So in the 1960s, the acute air pollution in ambient air, particulate problems, difficulty breathing, people wheezing, okay, we can solve this by building taller smokestacks. So if the smokestacks are taller, the ambient air, the immediate surroundings of a polluting facility will become much cleaner because the taller smokestack will take that pollution to another location. They actually used to say in the 1970s, the solution to pollution is dilution. So they practiced that in the Great Lakes and they practiced that in air sheds. So in the 1980s, the chickens are coming home to roost and the sulfur dioxide in the taller smokestacks was reaching thousands of kilometers from source and falling as sulfur caused acid rain. And Canada and the US had a kind of a symbiotic death grip in that 50% of the acid rain that fell on Canada was Canadian, 50% of the acid rain that fell on Canada was from the US, and the same was true south of the border. 50% of the acid rain that fell on the US came from Canada. We had the single largest point source of sulfur dioxide emissions anywhere in North America. That was the Inco smelter in Ontario. So what Canada decided to do was we won't go to the US and tell them they have to reduce their sulfur dioxide emissions in half until we have done the same. So Mulroney went, and actually through the Department of Environment and my boss, we went to every one of the 7 eastern provinces and signed agreements to get them to agree bilaterally, not everybody in a big room and one province could say no, one province at a time in negotiation with the federal government till all the provinces that were problems had agreed to 50% cuts in sulfur dioxide and then pressed the United States to meet it. And they did, but that's another longer story. So that felt really positive. At the same time, Environment Canada scientists were working on the problem of ozone depletion. Now, ozone depletion and the threat to the ozone layer was a complete shock to people who had felt that chlorofluorocarbons were practically a miracle molecule. It doesn't break down. You could deliver to the most sensitive lung tissues, you could deliver medicine with chlorofluorocarbons as the aerosol agent because they didn't interact with anything or break down. You could use them to propel deodorant, you could use them to propel medicine, you could use them to blow styrofoam, you could use them to cool in refrigerators. Because chlorofluorocarbons had this fantastic characteristic of being quite benign and stable. So again, the proponents of a product are never the best ones to tell you what might go wrong, but they couldn't have, I don't know if they could have predicted it. They didn't predict it. It wasn't until all of these chlorofluorocarbon molecules hit the stratosphere that the ultraviolet rays of the sun were strong enough to break them down. And then you had them split apart, releasing chlorine molecules, free agent chlorine molecules. And each chlorine molecule was like, it just gobbled up. One chlorine molecule could gobble up 80,000 molecules of ozone before it ceased to be active. So you suddenly had a problem that the ozone layer was under threat from a chemical that we thought was completely benign. And DuPont, as the manufacturer, large multinational, had made billions on chlorofluorocarbons. Their initial response is, this science isn't true, it's imaginary, the ozone layer is fine, the instrument readings are wrong, our molecules don't break down. In any case, by 1987, the evidence was so strong that DuPont had caved and started working on alternatives, so they didn't mind when, in September of 1987, we negotiated the Montreal Protocol that saved the ozone layer. So in these times when I was working in government, it was so obvious that we were succeeding, right? You have science, and the scientists at Environment Canada explain it to the minister, and the minister goes and tells the prime minister, and the prime minister says, well, we're going to have to do something about that. Now, in terms of sustainability, and you go back to the Brundtland Commission report, by the way, you'll find that the Brundtland Commission described 3 legs to the stool of sustainability. And we've forgotten one of the legs of the stool, so I do like to remind us. Our common future said in order to survive on the planet, we have to deal with 3 global crises: environment, development, and militarism. And the Brundtland Commission report pointed out that the countries of the earth were spending so much more in armaments and preparations for killing each other, and that if even a fraction of that could be diverted to, say, clean drinking water and feeding the world's poor, we would have no hungry children if we could put resources where we really wanted to put them. Now, in UN politics terms, what the Brundtland Commission report recommended was that there should be a major global summit in June of '92, because that would be exactly 20 years from the first UN conference that talked about environment. And that's a very significant commitment that they came up with it. There's always a kind of a magic to decades and anniversaries. This one was a little bit off because of what happened in US politics, but let's just go back to 1987 when the report from the Brundtland Commission was made on the floor of the United Nations. Canada strongly in support, countries around the world stepping up. What the UN General Assembly did with the report was say, a couple years later, okay, we should do a major global summit. And they dropped militarism from the agenda, and it moved ahead as environment and development. Now, in 1972 in Stockholm, at the first UN conference on the environment, and I know this is very ancient history, but it's still relevant today in what I want to talk about in terms of climate politics. Back in 1972, the first World Conference on the Human Environment, the Secretary General, by the way, was a Canadian, Maurice Strong. That first World Congress in Stockholm was met with a virtual boycott by the Global South. The only significant world leader to come from the Global South was Indira Gandhi. Most countries boycotted because they said pollution is a rich country's problem. It's not our problem. We can't feed our people, and you're trying to fob off on us limitations on development because of pollution in industrialized countries. So to have the conference 20 years later, which is what the United Nations General Assembly decided, they took the recommendation, June 1992, and a lot of you will know this. You think about it without even thinking. Yeah, the Rio Earth Summit happened in Brazil, a country that had boycotted this agenda 20 years earlier. So the Rio Earth Summit took on board what we then called the Rio Bargain, that we could not impose limitations on development on the world's poor. We had to focus on the consumption issues of the industrialized North. We had to accept that the industrialized world had created the problems that we were now looking at as being severely threatening human development and sustainability, particularly the climate crisis, but also the loss of biodiversity. So in this late 1980s period, as I was saying, we were feeling very buoyed by the reality that you could take on a big problem and solve it. Solve acid rain? Check. Solve ozone depletion? Check. Next goal, stop the loss of species extinctions and get action on global climate change. And we did, in fact, have 2 treaties negotiated in time that were signed at the Rio Earth Summit, one on biodiversity and the one we're still working under, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in time for a signing in Rio. And the same Canadian was Secretary General at Rio, Maurice Strong. One of the things that happened in between there was in 1988, Canada hosted the first really large public scientific conference on the climate crisis. It was in the last week of June 1988. It was addressed by two prime ministers. You can guess it's the two I've mentioned, Gro Harlem Brundtland from Norway, who was still prime minister, and Brian Mulroney for Canada. It was co-sponsored by the Government of Canada, the World Meteorological Organization, and the United Nations Environment Program. And in Mulroney's speech, which I'm going back to these heady days, he talked about how we were developing a global law of the atmosphere. We had law of the sea, and now he said we're developing a global law of the atmosphere. And the first plank of it was regional, dealing with acid rain. And the second plank was global, looking at ozone depletion. And the third plank will be going off fossil fuels so that we can deal with the climate crisis. Climate change. I don't think he used the term climate crisis yet. Back in the last week of June 1988, the only debate that was taking place about climate science was, are we already experiencing anthropogenic climate change? Are we already experiencing human-caused changes to our climate? Or are we still in the kind of natural weather variations that scientists talk about as the noise? Because there's a lot of variations. So in late June 1988, the first really well-respected, in fact, small c conservative scientist, no one thought he'd be the first one to go out on a limb and say, yeah, this heat wave right now in late June in Toronto, this is climate change. And that was a scientist, Dr. Kenneth Hare, who was one of our most respected scientists, was the first one to say, this is climate change. This is a signal that rises above the noise. This isn't part of the noise. So we didn't have anybody debating whether burning fossil fuels was going to disrupt the global climate. Nobody even suggested it was a question. And back to my friend Jim McNeil, who wrote the Brundtland Commission report, he often refers to the Rio Earth Summit, or he did, he passed away 2 years ago. It's really hard for me not to refer to him in the present tense. But anyway, Jim used to say that the Rio Earth Summit was when the Carbon Club was formed, because multinational fossil fuel companies realized for the first time that they were actually at threat of concerted political action to move off fossil fuels to protect us from the climate crisis. So when Brian Mulroney and Gro Harlem Brundtland opened this conference on climate change in June 1988 in Toronto, here we were with governments saying that we needed to act right away. I mean, by the way, in the UK, the Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher. She didn't doubt climate science. She set up the Hadley Centre to be able to deal with the climate science as it came in, because she was trained as a chemist. She may have been many things, but climate denier she was not. Brian Mulroney gave this wonderful speech about setting up the laws of the atmosphere. The conference itself, by the way, the title of the conference was Our Changing Atmosphere, Implications for Global Security. I often thought, yeah, we weren't even calling it an environmental issue in 1988. We're calling it a security threat. And the consensus statement of the scientists who gathered there in Toronto in June 1988 was this, consensus of 400 scientists from countries all around the world. Quote, humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to global nuclear war. And here I am, as a member of Parliament in 2018, looking across the aisles at my friends in the Liberal Party, who say the environment and the economy go hand in hand. That's why we have to build the Kinder Morgan pipeline. The internal lack of logic is staggering. So in terms of climate politics and climate science, and I'm deeply immersed in this, and I know that so is Catherine, we have an opportunity that's still before us to actually meet the Paris target. And when I discuss this with friends who are scientists, it is a subject of some debate, because the Paris target, where Canada and I'm so grateful that when our new government went to Paris in December 2015, Catherine McKenna, as our representative there, was the first head of a delegation from an industrialized country to say that the Paris Accord had to aim to hold global emissions to a level that would avoid going above 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase. I don't know how many of you have looked at climate science and if this term global average temperature is a new concept, or 1.5 versus 2, but it makes a huge difference to have the nations of the world, all of them, committed to holding global average temperature to no more than a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase over what it was before the Industrial Revolution. The difference between 1.5 and 2 is the difference between low-lying island states surviving, about being able to ever go see the Maldives in the year 2100, to find Fiji. To low-lying island states' survival depends on 1.5. For a lot of African countries, when we were gathered at Copenhagen for the disastrous negotiations in 2009, the African continent delegations marched out of those negotiations chanting 1.5 to stay alive. The difference between 1.5 and 2 is huge. And for those of us who live on a coastline, staying at 1.5 gives us a much better opportunity to avoid, because everything at this point becomes a gamble, becomes a risk. What are your odds? 1.5 gives us a much better chance to avoid losing the Western Antarctic ice sheet, which is ice that sits on land. So melting ice that's sitting on water doesn't affect sea level rise. Ice sitting on land, dislodging and relocating, has a big effect on sea level rise. So the Western Antarctic ice sheet is one to watch, and the Greenland ice sheet is the other one to watch. Either one of those collapsing has the effect of 8-meter sea level rise. We don't talk about that much, so it really matters to hold to 1.5. And to hit a 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase and not go above that essentially means we're off fossil fuels entirely by 2050. It may mean we have to go off sooner than that, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is going to release a report later this year that it was commissioned to do in Paris in 2015 for what the pathway to 1.5 looks like. How do we get there from here, and can we still get there? And when I debate this with people, my friends in science and the environmental movement, and just because these are private conversations, I won't go naming the eminent people with whom I have this debate all the time, I'm still in the camp that says we can get there. And they say, but look at the trend lines, look at all the commitments. You know, when we went into the Paris negotiations in December 2015, the collectivity of all the commitments made by all the governments going into the Paris Accord negotiations, if delivered on time to deadline exactly as promised, would not hit 1.5, would not hit 2. All the targets of governments taken together, if achieved, leave us with somewhere between 2.6 degree global average temperature increase to 3.4 degrees. And when you start studying climate science and you realize, well, there's those positive feedback loops. So the more we warm the oceans, the more we lose the ice particularly in the Arctic, and the more we lose the Arctic ice, the more we lose the albedo effect, because the white of the ice in the Arctic bounces the sun's rays back to space and keeps it from soaking in. But when we have dark ocean water, that solar radiation sinks in and warms the water faster to melt the ice faster, to reduce the albedo effect faster, to melt more ice. So that's why Arctic loss of ice has been much faster than what the Environment Canada scientists told us when I sat next to the minister and got those briefings in the late 80s. Same thing with permafrost melt. Can't afford to lose the world's permafrost. Every time permafrost melts, it releases methane that had been frozen there. So you start looking at this, okay, we have to really watch out for positive feedback loops that speed global warming faster than humans can speed it. There's a point at which there's nothing we can do. Right now, there's a lot we can do. So I have this debate all the time, looking at the evidence, what are we going to do? And I have to say, I'm convinced that it matters to keep fighting very, very hard to explain to people that we have a chance to hold to 1.5 by transitioning off fossil fuels quite rapidly. and doing everything we can to restore the carbon sinks that we've been eroding through deforestation. One kind of an ecosystem that I really want to bring back everywhere are mangrove forests. It was Professor Timothy Finley from Australia who pointed out how fast mangroves regrow. They grow everywhere. We've lost a third of the world's mangrove forests. Now these are equatorial forests. We don't have any mangroves in Canada, although if we let climate change run amok, we will. But we don't have any mangroves in Canada. But the world's mangrove forests are a great nursery for the world's fisheries. They are an enormous place for biodiversity, proboscis monkeys and all kinds of critters that don't live anywhere except mangrove forests. You know why we've lost 1/3 of the world's mangrove forests? It's for us. It's for tourism and cheap shrimp aquaculture. We have to restore all the world's mangrove forests, and that's actually a good thing not to be eating that shrimp because they also fill it with pesticides and antibiotics, so please don't buy cheap shrimp rings. Biodiversity and forests and carbon sinks restored as fast as possible everywhere, and going off fossil fuels fast. And it's really still possible to meet our Paris targets. Unfortunately, Canada came back from Paris and decided that we weren't even going to set a domestic target consistent with the one we just committed to in Paris. The government decided to keep the same target Harper had left us, which is inconsistent with Paris. So I know I want to close because we want to have our conversation, and I want to keep all of our conversation on time, and this is a really wonderful opportunity, and Catherine and I are going to chat, and then you'll get to ask me questions. But I don't, and I'm going to share with you something of an experiment, what I said the other day to a dear friend who said, I think it's too late. And believe it or not, I went all Churchill on him because I'd just seen The Darkest Hour. How many of you have seen The Darkest Hour, right? Okay, so you know there were 5 days in May 1940. And I'd heard about this actually from David Cameron, former UK Prime Minister. I'd never known about this, that there were 5 days in May 1940 when the British cabinet was seriously considering a proposal that they should surrender to Hitler while they still had time to negotiate good terms. Now, why were they doing that? Well, in these 5 days in May 1940, the entire British Army, pretty much, 300,000 soldiers were stranded on a beach in northern France with no hope of rescue, on a beach at Dunkirk. That's pretty bad, the entire British Army is stranded. And France has just fallen, Belgium's just fallen, Europe is falling before the forces of Hitler's army. And the cabinet that Churchill had put together, bear in mind Churchill wasn't a popular politician, and to put together this cabinet, he brought in a lot of his political enemies, sort of, to keep an eye on them. And he kind of brought in a few too many. So he has Neville Chamberlain there and Tony Eaton, and they're all saying, well, we've still got a chance. We've started feelers to Hitler. We can still talk to him. We can get good terms. They very nearly surrendered. So what's the climate equivalent of how do we launch every single little fishing boat and recreational vessel to cross the channel to rescue 300,000 soldiers? Because I tell you, even when I hear it as history, I don't see how they did it. How the hell? How do you do that? How do you get every tiny fishing boat off a British coast to sail to France? I can see maybe they could get 3,000 guys off the beach. Maybe. They rescued 300,000 people off the beach. They rescued the entire British Army. And then they said, we're going to have to go to war. All bets are off having our comfortable life anymore because actually we've gone to war. How do we marshal our own resolves and our resolve as citizens and human beings to say, nothing matters more, well certainly nothing matters more to sustainability than having a living biosphere. Nothing matters more for our kids and our grandchildren. And this is simple. The risk of people dying isn't in going to war. It's in laying down arms in fossil fuel appeasement and not doing anything about it. The risk to millions of lives is in continuing through fossil fuel addiction to allow climate crisis to breach all of our defenses and take over through positive feedback loops that we can't control anymore. So here and now in 2018, we have an absolute responsibility to explain to people that the path forward is actually quite optimistic and hopeful because we have all the technology we need to do two key things. It's nice to reduce it to two. We could say 5. We could say 1,000, but for now I'll just say 2. Get fossil fuels out of electricity production everywhere and eliminate internal combustion engines everywhere. 2 things, that's not bad. And do we have technological solutions to do those 2 things? Yeah, we do. Will we make money doing those 2 things? Some people will, some people won't, but most people will. And the smart corporations, believe it, like Shell, with its hydrogen division and its solar division, all the really large, smart, multinational fossil fuel companies. You may notice how many large multinational fossil fuel companies have left the oil sands. They don't have any investments there. They don't want stranded investments there. They don't want what Mark Carney in the Bank of England calls unburnable carbon. They're vacating. The Canadian business pages won't tell you that. If you read the Globe and Mail Canadian business pages, every time a large multinational fossil fuel company decides to get out of the oil sands while the getting's good, the headline is, "Great opportunity for Canadian investors because we're buying back our own oil companies." Because Norway's left, because ConocoPhillips has left, because, these companies are exiting the oil sands because they see the writing on the wall. So, we have a really good chance for a sustainable future. We have a really good chance to avoid the worst of the climate crisis. But that's all it is. And the odds aren't clear yet. Everything you do from now on improves our odds, and I'm betting on our future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. We'll talk for probably 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for the group.
We have to watch out that we're not rustling too much. Sound guys, are we rustling too much?
You know what? I think it's my scarf.
Oh, I'm glad it's you.
I bet it's me. There.
I was afraid it was me. Sorry. I don't know this pocket thing. Never mind. Let's hope it works. You good?
I'm afraid to move.
The scarf is very pretty, though.
Thank you. I want to start with my favorite sentence from your book, and that is, hope is...
Your glasses.
It's my glasses.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, we've got the salt. I'll put them on. Thank you. My favorite sentence in the book is, hope is hard. Yeah. And there's a passage where you talk about choosing to be hopeful. And I think, as one who has been studying and working on climate change for a long time, who works with students, and I have kids who are in their early 20s who are discouraged and find it discouraged and in some cases just kind of checking out. I just don't want to think about it anymore. So can you say more about what you mean by hope is hard and how you remain hopeful?
Yeah. Well, it's really important to share this because a lot of people would say, well, there's a kind of dewy-eyed naivete about being hopeful in times of climate crisis if you know the science, like what's wrong with you. It's actually hard work to hang on to hope. And my favorite sentence isn't mine, it's David Orr from Oberlin who said, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. Hope is work. And it's not just, and I am an optimist, and I back to my mom, I am genetically wired for optimism. It's lucky, because I feel so badly for friends who actually don't have this innate sense of optimism. It really is a kind of, I don't know what it is, a chemical thing that, I probably have some weird chemical imbalance that leaves me hopeful and positive and smiling all the time. When I went to law school, I can tell you, I remember when I was writing exams, the first semester exams, and I didn't realize I smiled all the time till one of my friends at law school said, for God's sake, we take that smile off your face. Everybody else is miserable. We're writing exams. Why are you smiling? I said, I didn't know I was smiling. So I am hopeful. I am optimistic. But in the context of the climate crisis, we have an obligation to face facts. We have an obligation to speak the truth about the facts we know. And we somehow have to do it in a way that doesn't leave people lying on the floor sobbing, which means and I actually believe we have the chance, we have the time. What we need is people who believe that they can make the difference that I know they can make.
Thank you. Another good line is Barbara Kingsolver's, that I choose to be optimistic. I wake up every morning making that choice. I loved your story today about your mother and her worship of FDR and how that empowered her as a citizen. One of the challenges we've got is increasing citizen disengagement, distrust in government, and in fact, many of the people here with us today are young, and we've got the lowest levels of political engagement in terms of voting, at least among young voters.
With the most at stake.
With the most at stake. And I'm wondering what your prescription is for them as young voters, or for changes to our system to give them reason to vote.
Well, give people reason to vote. You have to have, it does help to have candidates worth voting for, and it does help to change our voting system. One of the things I want, that I was thinking of talking about today is how, and I talk about it in the book a lot, how the dual challenges for me are democracy and climate together. So as democratic institutions erode, it becomes harder and harder to attack the climate crisis if we don't have trust in our democratic institutions. And our voting system is so perverse in terms of first past the post, and the fact that Harper came to power and canceled all climate action, canceled our, and this was without a vote in Parliament, by the way. This was when he had a minority, right? So 2006, the Conservatives had a minority. He said, we're not going to do our Kyoto target, just announced it, and canceled all the programs that the government of Paul Martin had put in place. More programs were put in place in 2005 than we have now, by the way, because I don't seem to be able to get the Liberals under Justin Trudeau to read the budget that Paul Martin put out with Finance Minister Ralph Goodale in 2005, which was full of good programs that Harper canceled. But with all of that happening, the problem of how did a political party leader like Stephen Harper become prime minister with so little public support? Well, it has to do with our first past the post voting system. And how did he win a majority government in 2011? Well, it's our first past the post voting system. And when we had, because of Justin Trudeau's promise to get rid of first past the post, which has now been removed, but I was on the Parliamentary Committee on Electoral Reform, and we had in front of us one of Canada's leading experts on political science and voting systems, Professor Emeritus from University of Toronto, Peter Russell. And it was a quite telling moment, because you hear a lot from those who say, let's not change our voting system. And I will take a moment on this because we're going to get this referendum in the fall. But you hear from people who support first past the post, well, Canada's a great country. We've had this voting system forever. What harm has ever come of it? So Peter Russell was in the witness chair before our committee, and one of the Conservatives said essentially this: we've had the first past the post forever. Nothing's ever gone wrong because of first past the post. Can you name one thing that's gone wrong because we had first past the post voting? And Peter Russell said, climate change. We had a commitment under Kyoto. We were moving ahead, and only because of first past the post, we had a government come to power that canceled. Oh, well, the Conservatives began to try to yell over him. But here's a political scientist who, when asked the question, name some time, some example when first past the post hurt us in a way that matters, and Peter Russell's example was climate change.
I never heard that story.
Yeah, it was one of many great bits of evidence that will go unheeded in terms of changing our voting system federally.
Let's talk Kinder Morgan. In the first year and a half or so of the Trudeau government's mandate, the argument was we need to address climate change, a commitment to adopt a national carbon pricing scheme, and a number of other good measures. But we need this pipeline, we need to expand our oil industry in order to afford the transition, which bit hard to square that circle. More recently, the Prime Minister has been a little more candid that this was a political deal, that he was able to get Alberta to sign on to a $50 carbon price by supporting the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And I'm curious what your reaction is to the argument that we've got to accept that this is just the best that we can do and that we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good, that this was necessary in order to move forward on Canadian climate policy?
It's so multiply ill-conceived, so fundamentally wrong-headed. It needs to be, I hate the term unpacked, but I got to do it. You know, when the Liberals were running, and I'm not a very partisan person, I was really happy to see Harper go. I voted for the speech from the throne that Trudeau put forward, because it included 2015 will be the last election under first past the post, and we will bring in climate action, and we will restore respect for science. I'm not so partisan that I won't vote for something that I think is actually going to turn out quite well. But what started to happen, and I mean, Paris was good. As I said, Catherine McKenna committed to 1.5 degrees Celsius there. I pushed her really hard. We had good conversations. But I started seeing it happening, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. It took me a while, and it's sort of a conspiratorial bent to begin to imagine that there was this large trade-off going on. And it was in my own head that I started saying, why did they approve wood fiber ahead of Howe Sound? Why is that LNG plant approved? That's a terrible project. Why would they approve that? And then midsummer, the federal permits came through for Site C. And I thought, what is going on here? Why are they approving Site C? And I began to, and when the shoe dropped and they approved Kinder Morgan in December, I thought, oh my God, this is all about, because when I talk to people in Ottawa, one of the things that you get back as pushback from federal Liberals when I first started saying to them, you can't approve Kinder Morgan. You need to, you do know that the NEB process was completely bogus. I mean, they'd said it on the campaign trail. No project can be approved that went through this bad process. We'd have to start over. I mean, Justin Trudeau literally said that. So I was horrified. I felt like I'd been kicked in the gut by a mule when they approved Kinder Morgan. And then suddenly it became clear to me, wait a minute, because what they say back to you is, Rachel needs a pipeline. They say it like, Rachel needs a pipeline. It's with pathos, like she's outside in the cold and she needs a winter coat. Rachel needs a pipeline. And what kind of person? So I thought, well, wait a minute. Then I realized Rachel needs a pipeline, Kinder Morgan, but Christie, she was premier then. Christie has 5 conditions for Kinder Morgan, and these aren't being met. So what are you going to do? Well, poor Christie needs LNG and Site C. So I began to realize this big trade-off in my head, and I began to say to my constituents, I think this is what happened. Like in town hall meetings, I'd say it out loud to constituents. I think because the Liberal platform said we will bring in carbon pricing, the Liberal platform had no target for climate action. She said, we'll bring in carbon, said we'll go to Paris, then we'll talk to the provinces, we'll bring in a carbon price. Okay, so Rachel needs a pipeline, Christie needs LNG and Site C, and then you get zing, 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 and everything is a tit for tat. It was appalling in its failure to examine the impact of Petronas. Now, thank God the Malaysian multinational Petronas has pulled out of building an LNG facility on Lalou Island, or we would have lost the Skeena salmon run, the second largest salmon run in BC. Because the evidence, and I say this, and I know you may want to challenge me later in question, but I'm absolutely certain that several federal government agencies actually agreed to fraudulent evidence from Petronas about the threat to wild salmon in order to approve that project. So they approved LNG at Lalou Island, they approved LNG in Howe Sound, they approved the Site C permits, and they approved the Kinder Morgan pipeline, violating a fundamental commitment to Indigenous peoples that was trumpeted in every single mandate letter to every single minister, that there is no relationship more important to us than our relationship with Indigenous peoples. We will operate with respect on a nation-to-nation basis, etc. And it was all about being able to put a check mark next to carbon pricing, which was in the Liberal platform. They didn't need, as clearly, because Saskatchewan hasn't agreed, they said, okay, we have a backstop. A province that doesn't agree to a carbon price, we will put in a federal carbon price and return all the funds collected from the federal carbon price to that provincial government. So they had a backstop. I think it was also a lot about the politics of Alberta. Rachel needs a pipeline so Jason Kenney doesn't become premier. So it was a complete betrayal of scientifically based information, a reasoned decision based on what's in the best interest of Canada economically, because that's another big piece to Kinder Morgan. There's no evidence that it helps Canada economically. There is no evidence that, I mean, they trumpet 15,000 jobs will be created. That number is a complete fiction. There is no study anywhere. Even Kinder Morgan's evidence before the National Energy Board never claimed that many jobs. So they make stuff up. The only evidence that the federal government has that Kinder Morgan will be good for our economy is that all the environmentalists are against it. Like, they don't think farther than that. So if it's always an environment and economy debate, well, obviously, if all the environmentalists are against it. I mean, I swear, Catherine, I'm in Parliament day to day. I'm in a state of, I seek serenity, but I'm in a state of rage. It's a complicated thing I have going on in my little corner of the House of Commons.
Thank you. Things are heating up on Kinder Morgan. You know, the bulldozers are about to arrive. There's construction starting. The arrests have begun. The Indigenous court cases are still making their way through the system, but as you saw on the weekend, the Tsleil-Waututh have built a watch house. Mm-hmm. The little houses are going up along the line in the valley. I'm struck that you have fought for stronger environmental protection through the system. Mm-hmm. You have worked for government. You've gone to court as a lawyer, you've become a member of parliament. And I'm curious how you reflect on civil disobedience as a tool for environmental change, because it's looming larger every day.
Yeah, well, first I want to say about the court cases that there are so many of them. And the national, as an aspect of democracy, I reflected on our voting system, but I should also reflect on the erosion of the integrity of our news media. I mean, how on earth did every major national outlet report that there were dueling protests on Saturday? Right. There were 10,000 people in Burnaby and maybe 200 in downtown Vancouver. I think there were more Albertans protesting against Kinder Morgan on the march in Burnaby than there were in downtown Vancouver. But anyway, it's also the failure to be willing to challenge the propaganda around Kinder Morgan. But one of the things the media also doesn't do well is talk about those court cases. So there are 3 different groupings of court cases that were all consolidated to be heard in the first 2 weeks of October of last year. There's the Indigenous court cases. Then there's the City of Burnaby, City of Vancouver, strong court cases, the ones that I would have brought as an intervener who saw my rights being abused. City of Burnaby, City of Vancouver, really strong court cases in the area of procedural fairness for those of you who practice law. And the third group, that the Species at Risk Act has statutory duties that are placed on a minister that include you can't wipe out the southern resident killer whales and approve a project that will do that. So there's 3 different groupings of legal arguments, none of which are weak. So we could be days away, weeks away, the decisions will be rendered sometime. Out of 15 court cases and arguments, if we win one, that means quashing the permits, which changes the dynamic of this issue quite a lot. Now, in terms of civil disobedience and the place for civil disobedience, I have never been arrested, but I'm not proud of it. As a record, really. It was an aspect of my work with Sierra Club of Canada. In those days, Sierra Club had a very strong commitment that our original charter had said we'd do everything we could to protect the environment within legal means. But if I look around the world at my Green Party colleagues, the leader of the Green Party of UK and Wales, who's the Member of Parliament for Brighton Pavilion, Carolyn Lucas, has been arrested fighting fracking. Petra Kelly, who founded the German Green Party, was arrested for chaining herself to nuclear installations. I really don't think there's any reason I wouldn't get arrested fighting Kinder Morgan, except that I'd rather win before we get to mass arrests. But if they persist in this abomination, which is really, a future court looking at crimes against the biosphere will find Kinder Morgan completely culpable, and they'll go off to jail in some future Nuremberg-like Earth trials. But for now, there's nothing. As long as the protests remain non-violent, I will always stand in solidarity with those protests. It's critical that everyone involved in the movement to stop Kinder Morgan, everyone involved in the movement to save the earth, remain nonviolent, because a single smashed window, and I think if a window were smashed in any protests, any of you, by the way, who are demonstrators, if you go out on I hope that this will be part of the training, if you see anyone acting particularly aggressive and threatening to hurt anyone else, throw a rock or break a window, take a picture and say as loudly as you can, "That's a cop." Don't fall for it. Honestly, the people who have engaged themselves in demonstrations in the past, and I've been part of them, whether in Seattle at the WTO, in Quebec City at the Summit of the Americas, I'm not being paranoid here, or the Security Prosperity Partnership meeting in Montebello where they actually got filmed, the people who were about to throw rocks, one of the leaders of the demonstration turned and said, "Wait," he said, "put down your rocks, put down your rocks," and he suddenly realized, those are cops. At which point one of them, wearing his bandana, you can find this on video, it's footage by Paul Manley, who was the Green Party candidate in Nanaimo Ladysmith, a wonderful filmmaker, happened to capture all this at Chateau Montebello, because I can tell some of you are thinking I'm a little paranoid. It was so marvelous, this footage. You can see one of the guys with the bandana who had a rock in his hand. There's a phalanx of police with plexiglass shields and the whole Darth Vader look. And one of these alleged protesters with his mask leans behind the plexiglass shield to whisper something to one of the police, at which point the police come out and arrest the guys who were holding the rocks. And Paul Manley, as filmmaker, films them and gets good footage of the bottom of their shoes, which on analysis turn out to be a specific boot made only for Sûreté du Québec. So it was eventually admitted that these were in fact agents provocateurs placed there as cops to infiltrate the demonstration. Stay nonviolent, a nonviolent code with civil disobedience is, you can't do nonviolent civil disobedience and claim the legitimacy of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and do anything violent. It is a nonviolent movement.
I've got one last question for you before we throw things open to the audience. Gender is an element in your book. It's not, the main theme, but we have just gone through quite an extraordinary period of increasing awareness of sexual violence against women and sexual harassment in many workplaces, including the Parliament of Canada. Me Too, Time's Up. What has been your experience, and what advice do you have for folks just starting their careers, not just women, but also men?
Yeah.
I think we tend to give the advice to the women.
Well, it certainly isn't. I mean, I was just watching the Canadian Screen Actors Awards and the Oscars, of course. Any gathering these days, it's a celebration of Me Too, but it's more than that. It's also saying, and what do the changes look like? So it's Frances McDormand uttering a piece of contract advice at the end of a speech. Inclusion rider. That was fabulous. People could start thinking about, right, how do we have a more diverse, how do we expand diversity? What does it look like? And I'm, as a person of privilege by virtue of being white, cisgender woman, I mean, it's just, I recognize that I'm in a place of privilege. So yes, women have been disadvantaged in a patriarchy for a very long time. And it would be extraordinary, which I think is actually possible now, because I was part of first wave feminism in the 60s. And one of my heroes, who I talk about a fair bit in the book, and there's a picture of me with Bella Abzug. Bella Abzug was a champion pioneer feminist and a member of the U.S. Congress from Brooklyn. But it's also important to have some humility about the role of women and recognize women aren't perfect either, and I wouldn't vote for someone just because they're a woman. And Bella used to say, a woman has just as much right as a man to be wrong. I'm not going to vote for someone just because they're a woman, they could be wrong. So advice to everyone is to be respectful to each other and recognize that the assumptions that are made about patriarchy have to be challenged, just as the assumptions that are made about colonialism and indigenizing our society and what's possible in real reconciliation is mind-blowingly creative for a different kind of society that is rooted in greater fairness, greater, and that's for men and for women. No one should be, and for trans and LGBTQ and for Two-Spirited and for New Canadians and for every religion and every atheist out there. This is about respect for each individual person and the person they choose to be, and that we see each other as everyone sees themselves. And that's a very exciting, if we really are, as I think we are, turning a page on the old boys network, and you can get away with it because you're a guy. No, you can't. It's very good.
It is indeed. Thanks very much. We've got time for questions. And we've got microphones on both sides, and I would ask that those who want to ask a question line up at the microphones, and would remind you that our
Can we
time
bring up
is...
our house lights so I can see people?
Yeah, we can't see you very well. Would ask that you limit your questions, make sure there is a question rather than a lengthy statement, because we've already got a line forming. And let's start on this side, please.
Great, thank you. Is this on? No?
Now it
Yes?
is.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was really wonderful, and I had the opportunity to see you on Sunday at your fundraiser with Wade Davis, which was
Wasn't
really
that
wonderful
fun?
too.
Thank you for coming.
I have multiple questions, but I think I'll stick to one. When you were saying, I thought it was very interesting when you were saying, oh, we have to build the pipeline for Rachel, and Christy needs a LNG plant, so let's gift it to them. So I have two sort of thoughts about that. Like, did the federal government care that much about the provinces? Oh, they really need this, they need that. And is it more about international foreign investment in oil and resources? And is it the threat of international court action that actually might be more the driving motivation to do these different developments?
I hate to say, I think it's really quite local. I think Rachel needs a pipeline. And the federal liberals, and I have to say, I knew all the federal conservatives too. I worked, I tried to convince Stephen Harper of things, and I'd give it the old college try every time. But the reality is that they didn't want to see Jason Kenney. They want to see Rachel Notley reelected. They don't want to see Jason Kenney the Premier of Alberta. They don't want that headache. They can still get a carbon price. I mean, what they adopted from Rachel Notley's climate plan is so appalling. If you care about the climate, you can hardly begin to believe that they're celebrating, and this includes some of the environmental groups, celebrating a cap, sorry, I'm doing something wrong with this, celebrating a cap on emissions. A cap on emissions in Alberta at 100 megatons a year. Current emissions are somewhere around 70 megatons a year. So the cap on emissions in the oil sands is an enormous increase in emissions in a period of time when we're supposed to be moving off fossil fuels to hit the Paris target. So Rachel Notley's going to go to 100 megatons a year, and that's part of her climate plan, and, it sounded good at first, shut down coal-fired electricity in Alberta. That's a good commitment because coal-fired electricity in Alberta emits just as many greenhouse gases as the oil sands. Make sure everybody heard that. So that's TransAlta. They have a private sector utility in Alberta that burns coal for electricity. And Rachel Notley, as part of the trade-off to get the Kinder Morgan pipeline, promised to go off coal by 2030. Except they're not going to renewables. They're going to take the existing coal plants and retrofit them to burn fracked natural gas, which has the same carbon footprint as coal. And the federal government is about to sign off on the weakest regs for natural gas burning electricity generation, not even best available technology. The whole thing is an atrocity if you're grounded in climate science. But if you think, well, there's going to be an election soon, and we want to help Rachel Notley, and a lot of the environmental groups are worried, well, we really don't want to lose Trudeau because he's much better than Harper, which is true. But I don't think they're looking at international investments at all. Actually, if they were looking at where the international money is going, they'd be doing less fossil fuel.
Okay. Thank you.
sort of prosaic, but I think it's true.
This side.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Hi, I'm a journalism and media student here. My name is Graham. The question I had, you kind of touched on, but it's basically like for some of us, and I guess maybe not the people in this room, but for a majority of us, we do live in that sort of culture of continuing apathy and sort of distance from political discourse. How, on like a smaller scale, how would you go about sort of just encouraging and cultivating that sort of nature of caring, I guess, in your like friends, family, and communities for them to take a better interest or a more significant interest in the sort of larger political community and the sphere in Canada and I guess internationally?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think people aren't, I reject the idea that people aren't caring. I think there's a very large disconnect between political action and an aspect of caring. Because political action and government are so alien from people most of the time. And this is a product of the generational change. I talked about my mother's childhood. My childhood was also empowering. But anything that's happened since neoliberalism took hold, so the Thatcher and Reagan era of demonizing government was a new concept. In a democracy, it's brand new, relatively speaking. Okay, anything that happened in the 1980s, for all of you here who weren't born then, is hardly new. But for me, I see that neoliberalism, the mantra of smaller government's better, deregulation is an important part for economic growth, trade liberalization. So you got this, it was what Naomi Klein called in This Changes Everything. She referred to the climate crisis as suffering from a problem of bad timing. And that's all about the takeover of neoliberalism and the World Trade Organization. I mean, so anyway, in terms of what you do on a day-to-day basis to talk to people, I'm struggling with that. I'm wondering if recognizing that government used to be a tool of public policy to serve the interests of the common good, that corporate rule is our problem, not capitalism, that we can re-engage in the public sphere as citizens to demand that our governments do the right thing. And that the only thing keeping us from being certain to have a livable world is our own ability to take back control over democratic institutions in a meaningful way. Would that help? What do you think, Graham?
I think it falls on, especially now that everything's online and with the 24-hour news cycle that is continuous, people do sort of tune out and people do sort of, it's overwhelming, I guess, to the fact that like you get headline after headline after headline about whatever happening in the world today. But yeah, I think definitely sort of centralizing it and humanizing it again on like a individual level and being like, this is how it affects you personally.
Yeah.
Will definitely help.
It's interesting, you reminded me about the second part of what David Cameron, as former Prime Minister of the UK, and as I said, I was hearing him speak and talking about these 5 days in May 1940 that I'd never known about. But the second part of what he said is when he'd stand in that cabinet room and think about the history of that room and what it meant to be Prime Minister of the UK in May 1940, and then he realized, he said, I don't think we could have had 5 days of a cabinet meeting now because of social media. Everybody'd be tweeting things, we'd never have the time, who would want to discuss it? So it is kind of overwhelming. We're in a different time. On the other hand, social media tools have the potential, although potential for ill as well as for good, but there's still the potential for democratizing things. So
it definitely gives voices to some people who haven't had that opportunity to have their voices heard.
Yeah. So greater transparency, greater democratization, but also you have to know that the algorithms that are out there to influence people by feeding them fake news are very sophisticated and change the courses of elections. So we need to have a highly engaged, informed citizenry with really good critical thinking skills, which means there's no more important investment anywhere than education.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Back to this side.
Hi, thank you for your talk today. To answer the lady's first question in line about where the money is coming from for the pipeline construction, I was at Burnaby Mountain on Saturday, and there was a group called Climate Convergence handing out leaflets that pointed out the single biggest source of funds for the Kinder Morgan pipeline is the Toronto Dominion Bank. So a lot of our so-called foreign investment is actually generated here in Canada. But maybe you want to comment on that. But my question is, or comment, and I'd like your comment. Greenpeace has come out just within the last couple of weeks as calling for a reduction of meat and dairy consumption in Canada by half, pointing out that that's the only way we're going to meet our climate agreement targets in Paris. And the Chinese government, a couple of years back, have said the same thing, but for health reasons, saying that their population needs to cut their meat and dairy consumption in half for health reasons. I'm somebody that's reversed heart disease. I've been a vegan for 6 years. It's been a world of difference. I'm off most of my heart drugs, and I'd just ask you for a comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the chance to speak to us. There are many things an individual can do to address the climate crisis, and one of them is to eat less meat, but it doesn't equal the impact of not driving. So let me just go back to that a little bit. There are some statistics out there that exaggerate how much the meat and dairy industry contribute to climate change. Globally, I think the right figure is about 17%, which isn't small. And that's a combination of deforestation, particularly in the tropics, and the acute contribution of the industry in terms of production and transit and so on. So it's important. I don't happen to eat meat. I haven't eaten meat since I was 10, and I don't eat meat or poultry, but that's a long story. It's just, and I'm glad I don't. I hope it helps with health. But I know that if we could get people to think about meatless Mondays, just reducing consumption, but overwhelmingly what we need to do is large system change to get fossil fuels out of electricity generation and get rid of the internal combustion engine. And of course, small-scale, organic, local growing is always healthier for a local community and keeping farmers alive. So I don't think that step alone will help us, will get to our Paris targets. It'll help. But overwhelmingly, Canada has the bulk of our emissions come from 500 specific plants. You can find them listed on the Environment Canada website. And they are coal-burning electricity generation plants. They are concrete manufacturing. They are large-scale facilities. They're the oil sands. So individual Canadians changing lifestyle issues can make a difference. But there are some very large polluters that need to be brought to heel. And if we're going to meet our climate commitments for Paris, we have to phase out fossil fuel dependency rather rapidly and restore our carbon sinks. And part of restoring carbon sinks is to reduce the loss of Amazon rainforest, particularly for growing livestock. But it's a transition off of dependency on, and I know I have a lot of friends who are vegan, and I completely buy what you're saying in terms of health. There are a lot of benefits to going off meat and poultry and dairy, but for the climate crisis, the changes need to be bigger.
Thank you.
Hi, Elizabeth. Good to see you again.
Hi, Chad.
This question is actually both for your political side and for your lawyer side. So the first off, I'm going to say, in response to David Suzuki's interview with the National Observer, he was really fed up with politics because he says politicians are pretty much if you become a politician, you give up being a father. So this notion of I know you also said you're nonpartisan, which is great.
Which what?
You said you're nonpartisan, which is great because you're the leader of the Green Party, so
Yeah.
of course you're nonpartisan. But
I am. I'd love to get rid of all political parties. You
Yeah,
can't get more nonpartisan than that.
Yeah, precisely. So I just want to take, first of all, going back to the federal election when this province swept orange, and you debated Tom Mulcair in Maclean's, and you pointedly asked him about Kinder Morgan, and he refused to answer you. And then the fact that this province went orange. The other side of the coin is these court cases are a result of Stephen Harper changing the National Energy Board process for consultation on Kinder Morgan because of the prolonged, problematic way by which the Northern Gateway Project consultation process occurred. And so Justin Trudeau was actually brought into Prime Minister after the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in favor of Gig Island Nation, who spent $5 million, this tiny community on Dolphin Island, to fight this project and win. And it seems to me that Jody Wilson-Raybould, who is the Attorney General of Canada, this is your legal hat, lawyer hat, is, she must have been and she's also Aboriginal, must have some kind of awareness of the potential for these court cases to bring this project down, and that Justin Trudeau somehow must be aware of the potential for them to come down. So if in a political campaign to win election, a party moves so far away from its principles, like Tom Mulcair did on Kinder Morgan, and then on the other side, a government gets elected, and they have knowledge that they think that this project is very well not going to be approved for judicial reasons, but I'm going to go ahead and commit political suicide anyway. Like, that's pretty scary, and I wanted to know if you could just discuss a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I don't think... And David Suzuki is one of my best friends, so I suppose I could ask him, could you please, when you give interviews, say, except for Elizabeth, of course, because I don't mean her. But anyway, I'm lucky enough that David's been such a good friend for so many years. Look, the court cases are looming, and I find it extraordinary that Justin Trudeau and Jim Carr, Minister of Natural Resources, stand up in the House of Commons and say that pipeline will be built. What are you going to say if the court says that this had violated the constitutionally protected rights of the Tsleil-Waututh and the Musqueam and the Squamish First Nations? And by the way, that the City of Vancouver has won and the City of Burnaby has won because procedural fairness was not observed in the way the court case, the way the NEB process ran, and that the southern resident killer whales need protection. I mean, they've tied themselves in a very large knot, and I don't know why they've done that. I must be missing something in terms of where the politics lie here. For Pam Goldsmith-Jones, who was elected in West Vancouver's Sunshine Coast Sea to Sky Country, and I know she told people that she would fight the wood fiber plant, or Terry Beach, who won in Burnaby, who said he would fight Kinder Morgan. There have been so many Liberal MPs where the local politics are not good for them, or even the commitment on electoral reform that Joyce Murray worked so hard on. So individual Liberal MPs in this part of the world have got to be feeling really nervous, and yet when they said to, and by the way, I'm speaking later tonight on the new environmental assessment legislation and how bad it is, but when they said to Catherine McKenna, our Minister of Environment and Climate Change, I've been tempted to call her in Parliament the Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Pipelines, but I know that'll sound cruel. But they asked her whether under this new process Kinder Morgan would have been approved. I mean, I think the right answer, the fair answer, is to say, well, we won't know because that's not the process that was used. But I guess because they already approved Kinder Morgan under the bogus process that was put through under Harper's Bill C-38. The new process, by the way, is also bogus. But Catherine McKenna's answer was to say, of course it would have. I'm like, wow, does she have a time machine to go back and get free, prior, and informed consent from First Nations along the pipeline route before you say, of course? I mean, those are large questions, and I don't think they've done themselves a service, because I do think these are, as individuals, these are good people. As individuals, I think they'd rather make a good decision than a bad one. But they've made a whole slew of really bad decisions, and now they're getting defensive about them, which is only human nature.
So we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask that you ask a very short question.
And maybe I'll try to give a shorter answer. Sorry about that.
Okay, I wonder if you could comment on what went right with the Energy East pipeline. That was cancelled. There were, Alberta was to ship bitumen to Eastern Canada for consumption by Canadians. It was cancelled.
Yeah.
No maple syrup embargoes, no tourtière or poutine. And yet, what can we learn? Are politicians afraid of Quebec? Why can't we have the same kind of successful cancellation of this pipeline as they had out there?
Okay, so two quick things. Energy East propaganda is extraordinary, but you need to know the Energy East pipeline was just like Kinder Morgan, just like Enbridge, just like Keystone, all about export of raw bitumen. The refineries in eastern Canada can't process bitumen any more than the refinery in Burnaby can process bitumen. They were dredging St. John Harbor for bigger tankers. Energy East was not about domestic use of oil, although the product line was roughly 80% diluted bitumen and would have been about 20% synthetic crude or Bakken shale, which the refinery could have processed, okay? So the Irving Oil Refinery was not planning an upgrader, therefore they couldn't have refined it. And the Energy East project was not canceled by government. Unless you count Trump, you could say the Energy East pipeline was canceled by Trump when he approved Keystone, because the same proponent company, TransCanada, was behind both pipelines and they didn't have enough product for both. They were going to cancel one or the other. And when Keystone got approved by the US government, the business case for Energy East evaporated. The government did not cancel Energy East. Okay. Amazing, eh? You'd swear that both of the things you said were true because that's how the national media reports most of it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And if you want to check the economics of what I just said about Energy East, University of Edmonton professor Andrew Leach has written lots of good stuff on it.
I'm afraid we're not going to have time to get to those who are still standing, but Elizabeth is going to be staying around, is available to sign the book. I brought mine so I can get mine signed as well. It's a great read. And I want to close by thanking you, Elizabeth, for a call to action, reasons for hope, a new line in Going All Winston Churchill, and a reminder that a little humor also helps when we're fighting these battles.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.